Today we're going to talk about 4 aspects of persuasion. The first step in persuasion is to listen. We often try to convince people by talking, but if we want to convince people, the first thing we need to do is listen to them. We're going to talk about highlighting areas of agreement. We'll talk about stating what we believe and how to do that. And finally, we'll talk about being patient. All right, let's talk about listening. If you were in a debate tournament, would you rather go first or last? Last, of course. Everyone would rather go last in a debate because that way you get to hear the other person's arguments before you make your own. Now let me ask you, how many times in real life do you give away that primary position by trying to argue your point before you've thoroughly listened to the other person's perspective? I bet in real life, maybe 99 times out of 100, when you're trying to convince someone of something, you start out by telling them what you believe instead of listening to what they believe. And by doing so, you're giving up the prime spot in the debate. You want to listen to the person before you make your case because you want to understand their argument. We've talked a lot and practiced a lot the 6 elements of listening in this course. So we talked about listening to understand, asking open-ended questions, observing nonverbals, using minimal reinforcers, embracing silence, and restating the message. So we're going to go through each of these again and how specifically to utilize them within a persuasion scenario. So begin by listening with a non-judgmental attitude. There are 2 reasons to listen with a non-judgmental attitude. Number 1, we don't want to make the other person defensive, right? We've talked a lot about how if you're judgmental of people, if you're critical, they get defensive. So by being non-judgmental, we help ensure that other people won't get defensive. That's the first reason. The second reason that you should begin by listening with a non-judgmental attitude is go into every argument assuming that you could be wrong. You might be wrong, so you should listen to the other person. All right, so we, by being non-judgmental, by being non-critical, by being open to the other person's perspective, by focusing on their ideas and not the person themselves, we can ensure that the other person doesn't get defensive as we're talking to them. So the first reason you need to begin by listening with a non-judgmental attitude is so you don't make the other person defensive. The other reason that you need to listen with a non-judgmental attitude is because you might be wrong. And there's an old saying that being influenceable is the key to being influential, which means that if you expect or want someone to open up their mind and be willing to change their opinion based on the merits of your argument, then you need to open up your mind and be willing to change your opinion based on the merits of their argument. That it can't be a one-way street. That if you are going to try to persuade someone of something, you have to be open to persuasion as well. And you should quit looking at persuasion as the success of being persuasive is your idea being adopted. The success of being persuasive is finding the best idea. And that might be your idea, it might not. So you're probably wrong a lot. I consider myself a pretty bright person, and I'm probably wrong 60% of the time. God, probably 75% of the time. If I ever get down to only being wrong half of the time, that's my life goal. I think that is true genius, to only be wrong half the time. We're wrong because we get lied to a lot for some reason. I don't know about you, but when I was in junior high and we were talking about Columbus, they were like, man, Columbus was this visionary genius. Everyone thought the world was flat, and Columbus was, bold and courageous, and he knew the world was round. That whole story is BS. That educated people have known that the world is round since about 3,000 years ago. Every educated person in Columbus's time knew the world was round. No one thought the world was flat. So yeah, we just get told these stories. It makes a good story, but it's not actually true. Same thing if you've ever heard that Einstein failed math when he was a kid. That's not true. He was always a mathematical prodigy. Or that carrots are good for your vision. That is not true. That is a lie started by the British during World War II. Because they didn't want the Germans to know they had discovered radar. So we're probably wrong a lot because there's just a lot of misinformation floating around in our lives, and we're not always as critical about the information that goes into our minds as we possibly should be. There's an old saying that keep an open mind, but not so open your brain falls out. So be open to other people's ideas, but that doesn't mean that you have to believe everything that you hear. So the first thing we do to persuade someone is to listen to them. That prevents them from being defensive, and because we might be wrong, we need to hear their argument because it might be more persuasive than ours.